Resident Evil.
We've all heard that 1996's Resident Evil was the first game to coin the term survival horror, but neither Resident Evil nor the philosophy it was designed under just popped into Shinji Mikami and Capcom's head fully formed. Wham bam, thank you ma'am.
I can't believe it!
Director Shinji Mikami would finally admit in 2014 that there was more influence on Resident Evil than just 1989's Sweet Home, which it was intended to be a remake of. Early on in its development, Resident Evil had been languishing as an FPS Doom clone until Mikami played Infogram's Alone in the Dark and found that its fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, and tank controls were a perfect fit for his zombie game. I guess you could say that Resident Evil went from being a Doom clone to a clone in the dark. A clone in the dark. Okay, don't act like you didn't think that was hilarious. So while the cat's out of the bag on that inspiration, I don't think that the answer to the question of who started survival horror can really just be summed up by saying Alone in the Dark, no matter how formative that game was or how much of it was copied by Resident Evil. Survival horror mechanics like complex puzzle solving, inventory management, backtracking, limited resources, and the dilemma of whether to fight or flee from sometimes invincible enemies had been percolating in numerous games since the early 70s, but it's these pioneers of terror that I want to highlight today and give them their just due. Now of course, calling any of these games survival horror is probably wrong-headed, as noted historian Bernard Perron claims.
So trying to say that, there's survival horror exists before 96, as a scholar, I have really a real difficulty because the label didn't exist. So we're trying to, label something back then that was not taught in that vision.
Because they're unintentional prototypes of a now recognized concept, they can't really be reasonably held to the same standard or expected to elicit every feature that the genre's ever had. But these games are all excellent examples of often the very first time nailing down these mechanics and showing why they could work so well together when remixed in later titles. Everything starts somewhere, and survival horror is no different. So if you're not too scared to continue, let's get stuck into the untold history of one of gaming's greatest genres, the survival horror. Survival horror as we know it seems, to the best of historians' knowledge, to have started off innocuously enough in a turn-based text-adventure game of all things back in 1973 with Hunt the Wumpus. Hunt the Wumpus was the brainchild of the eccentric and innovative Gregory Yob. As we revealed in his creative computing software interview, Yob had grown tired of Hercule, Snark, and Mugwump, which are surprisingly not Dr. Seuss books, but the names of 3 hide-and-seek puzzle games set on a 10x10 grid system that Yob found too simplistic to be entertaining for very long. So Yob envisioned a more complex and interesting version of these games set in a dodecahedron cave system of 20 rooms, each with 3 exits to adjoining rooms. You'd spawn into a random room as a hunter with 5 arrows, and would have to traverse the completely dark caves to find the Wumpus, shoot him, and win the game. Your only aid in this endeavor would be text warnings that flashed up on screen that told you whether a hazard or the Wumpus itself was in one of the next 3 adjoining rooms over. If you felt a draft, it meant that a pit was nearby, and falling into that pit meant instant death. If you hear fluttering nearby, that means you're 1 step away from running into a bat, which will teleport you to a random room, possibly even to your death in a pit. If you smell a Wumpus, that could mean that you venture on and possibly get murked, or do the murking yourself if you choose to shoot an arrow into the right room instead of advancing. You have to make an educated guess, and that's part of the fun. You can try to fire off an arrow if he's nearby to end the game, and you have up to 5 rooms to send that arrow through in hopes of snagging him. Cool as that sounds, you've only got 5 arrows unless you're lucky enough to stumble upon the scant few others in the cave. So you've got to make sure that you don't run out of ways to win the game, and also realize that if you guess wrong and miss, you startle the Wumpus so that he moves into a different room and the chase continues. Best case, you got to track him all over again, and worst case, he can move into your room sometimes and insta-kill you. There's a lot of luck involved, but this air of randomness keeps things deliciously tense and exciting. Yob recalls being quite pleased when he traveled to a conference at Stanford after he'd released the game, seeing that players had set up computers all over the place and were avidly writing out map diagrams of the caves, totally engrossed in their attempts to outwit the game. This popularity caused Hunt the Wumpus to be ported into much more pleasing and visually interesting versions later on, and it would get featured in several magazines, even being called one of Time magazine's top 100 greatest video games ever. The Wumpus monster even became a Magic the Gathering card. But most importantly, Yob's Hunt the Wumpus set the stage for what survival horror games would later really lean into. An isolated setting, limited resources, items you could pick up to help your chances of survival, a stalker enemy, and environmental hazards getting in your way. Ewan Kirkland, in his essay Restless Dreams and Silent Hill, Approaches to Video Game Analysis, said that,
"From a historical perspective, the genre's roots lie in Hunt the Wumpus."
Dorothy Fisher-Hornung and Monica Mueller say the same thing in their book Vampires and Zombies, Transcultural Migrations and Transnational Interpretations. Bernard Perron disagrees, however, as he might, because Hunt the Wumpus is mostly a puzzle or an adventure game. He says that nothing here is specifically designed to frighten the player with anything but death and failure, and, having to retry. The player is the hunted and not the hunted. These are actually pretty interesting observations and technically correct, but it also may be a case of being right for the wrong reasons. As Perron himself said in the Terabytes documentary, it's hard to call these formative experiences survival horror as such because the world was in the process of making games that would even make the term survival horror have any meaning eventually, that would even make that term come to be, and would have any connotation of, any distinct features and tropes. But a good faith, or maybe better faith reading, is that Hunt the Wumpus was trafficking in the mechanics and considerations that later survival horror games would make their bones off of. So I think this is as good a place as any to say that we've started figuring out what a survival horror game would look like. And plus, how could I deny such an achievement to a guy in Gregory Yob who epitomizes the hardcore wackiness of survival horror? He loves psychedelics and Eastern spirituality and called himself a neo-neuro-cyber shaman when he wasn't going by the name Hara-Ra after the second chakra in Japanese spiritualism and the Egyptian god of the sun. After he was given a vision through time and space from the Amazon itself, according to his partner Andrea. This is also a guy who requested his severed head be put into cryonic suspension after his death so that he could be resurrected once the technology became available in the future. This guy is just waiting for the T-virus to come wake him up. So thanks to Hara-Ra, Gregory Yob, Founding Father, your creativity precedes you. And while the neo-neuro-cyber shaman got the petri dish cooking, games that would mutate the little formless amoeba within didn't start coming hard and fast until the 1980s, not unlike your mom actually.
What the fuck?
So after 7 years of relative silence on the front of games that would advance survival horror mechanics, we got a glut of them in 1980, starting with House of Usher by Crystalware, based on the famous Edgar Allan Poe short story The Fall of the House of Usher, written in 1839. The game starts with Bach's classic toccata and fugue in D minor, and then a convincing thunderstorm effect for the time. You start out with 999 stamina, 25 offense, 50 defense, an 150-pound weight limit, a weapon with a healthy dollop of ammo, and 0 courage. Rude. The clock starts at 1800 hours, and you've got until 0600 hours to win the game, and you can win in one of 3 ways. Collect 1000 wealth, increase courage to 1000, or solve the mysterious puzzle. You can move in all 4 directions to travel between 40-ish rooms in search of new weapons to increase your offense or armor to increase defense, as well as for treasure for the wealth win condition. The mansion layout stays the same, but the items and monsters within appear randomly every time you play. Stamina decreases rapidly as you run around, and you can only replenish it with potions. The house itself is also a bit of an enemy, as, for instance, bumping into the piano can either give you just some backstory, or it can slam your fingers, or it can even knock you out for 1 hour of in-game time with its haunting melody. Alternatively, much like how the floor would collapse beneath Edward Carnby and Dorsetto Manor, or reading certain books could kill you, the House of Usher is trafficking pretty hard in survival horror tropes nearly a decade before they'd ever be touched on again in such smart detail. That prescience extends to the combat. The game gives you a couple seconds to get your bearings and line up a shot anytime a monster randomly appears, but you've really got to make it count, as any monster getting too close usually spells your doom. It's a classic stop and pop style of tense aiming, just hoping that you'll be able to kill them in time before they get to you, and mechanics like this wouldn't be seen again until Project Firestart, Alone in the Dark, and Resident Evil, which is in pretty great company. While the combat's not easy and it's not always the best option, it was CRPG Addict's favorite way to win, as described in their review, because you only had to kill a couple enemies to get your courage up to a winning number. Trying to win while carting around the 1k wealth usually depleted your stamina too much because it burned you above that 150-pound limit, but at least it wasn't trying to solve the mystery, which is apparently super out there. CRPG Addict kept trying to solve the riddle, but to no avail. The game even has a message from the devs inside the game promising a $100 prize to the first person to solve the puzzle, so I wonder if anybody ever cashed in. So yeah, this game isn't much to look at these days, but man is it just chock full of good ideas and balances them well against each other. You've got limited stamina, but you'll need to explore around the area to improve your character and find ways to replenish your stamina, backtracking across the mansion to find what you need to win. The combat model is a perfect prototype in many ways of the set shooting where you've got to line up a shot as the bad guys close in. In fact, this game is so far ahead of its time, it may be a little weird to see how many games it takes to get back here. A similar looking project, but set in first person, also came out in 1980, and that was Deathmaze 5000, which is probably the edgiest name that gaming had ever seen at this point. Developed by Frank Core Jr. and published by Med Systems Software for the Apple II and the TRS-80. Much like the first Ultima game called Alcalabeth in 1979, this is a black and white first-person adventure where you tepidly make your way through a maze of claustrophobic hallways, scrounging for items to solve environmental puzzles, and also for food to avoid starving, and torches to be able to see in the dark. If you run out of either resource, you'll perish mightily. And if that sounds pretty hardcore, it apparently was. Just ask Deborah Marshall. In the February 1981 issue of Microcomputing magazine, she describes her experience with Deathmaze 5000 as
the most infuriating, irritating, aggravating, frustrating, angering, spellbinding game on the market. Whoever wrote it is a pure nut. Just thinking about it makes my blood boil, my teeth chatter, and I get an overpowering urge to try it again, just once more.
Deborah goes on to say how wild the puzzles are, like how do a rotten sneaker, a dagger, a frisbee, a hat with ram's horns, and a broken calculator supposed to fit together? Or as the game says, a close inspection reveals nothing. It's classic adventure game moon logic that point-and-click adventures would gladly take up the torch for, and later survival horror like Alone in the Dark and Silent Hill would just wallow in like a pig in shit. You'll need all your wits about you, and as the opening screen says, you'll also need to be aware that there are 5 interconnected levels where the connections aren't always obvious. Multiple movement is available through fart and other words you will need. Some useful words are... Wait, fart? Some useful words are open, get, drop, save game, and fart? Do my big brown eyes deceive me? And many more words exist. Okay. Oh my, how the mind boggles with glee with what's possible if fart is only the beginning. Is this the best game ever? Maybe not, but it is a really interesting one. It's no looker, as many games of that era weren't, hence why Pac-Man was such a delight that same year, but I have to applaud the feel of the game as this isolated adventure where you're trying to figure out the crazed logic of the puzzles, carrying around the bare essentials and surviving as best you can, hoping not to run out of resources. I do think it's significant that it gets down the tactile 3D feeling of how backtracking, resource management, and the impending doom of scarcities that might spell game over for you, work together for one, if not the first time in gaming's history, which helps set a standard that would be iterated on, specifically or indirectly, for many years to come. But we'd soon get a fuller version of what we think of survival horror in Usher Nostromo, or Space Freighter Nostromo in 1981. Space Freighter Nostromo, which we'll just call Nostromo henceforth, is widely looked on as one of the very first survival horror games ever made. You start out in a little red-colored nook. From there, you enter a simple area with 8 storage areas that have various collections of items that resemble playing card suites like diamonds, clubs, hearts, and spades. You have to shoot out the walls of these containers and collect 4 of each suite inside them to beat the level, but you have to fight the 300-second clock and also avoid the alien who's roaming the halls to do so. You can return to the red starting area as a safe zone in hopes the alien will pass you by, or you can hide in one of those storage containers, hoping to lose the alien for a bit. Judging by this design and how later levels would have the alien disappearing and reappearing at will, I can see how this would have been a really scary game for the early 80s. Most importantly, it's one of the very first games that had convincing tension, as you have no way to rebuff the alien. You can only run and hide and wait for the alien to pass by and then venture back out to get the items that you need to finish the level. Whereas games like Pac-Man the year before had felt a little jaunty because you were fairly fast, here your disempowerment of slower movement than your enemy and the inability to influence their AI through combat or debuffs makes the proceedings quite nerve-wracking. The other strong contender for a very first ever survival horror game is Haunted House by James Andresen in 1982 for the Atari 2600.
Beware, playing Atari can be pretty hair-raising. Atari, simply more fun and games.
And what's important about this game is not so much its atmosphere and its feel, but its mechanics. In Haunted House, you control a pair of eyes as you traverse a top-down map of 24 rooms across 4 floors that are teeming with spiders and bats and a ghost. To win, you had to find all the pieces of an urn, but you can only pick up these urn pieces if you had first lit a match to see them, which is symbolized by the edges of the map turning yellow. Though matches were unlimited as they'd respawn occasionally around the map, you still had to risk running into enemies because all the items are in these corner pockets of the rooms, and only the first of 9 difficulty levels showed you the surrounding room walls unless you lit a match. You could only carry one inventory item at a time, not counting the matches, meaning that you had to put down the urn you were assembling if you picked up the scepter, which made you invisible to enemies, or the master key, which was hidden in later levels and was required to be found in stages 3 through 9 to progress through all the locked doors. You also only had 9 lives to win the game. Further friction was how enemies getting closer was accompanied by a gust of wind that could put out one of your precious matches. The spiders were fairly slow, but the bats were much faster and could track the player much better. The most fearsome of all was the ghost of Mr. Graves, the house's old owner, who chased you very quickly and could pass through walls in its relentless pursuit of you. And unlike many of the other games on this list so far that have survival horror mechanics but little atmosphere, Haunted House's darkness contributed to a feeling of unease, and coupled with the rolling thunder outside and the flashes of lightning, the game really starts to feel like a horror movie, and not just an approximation of some of the ardor of escaping a scary place. A famous GameSpy article reasonably called this the first survival horror game, and even Bernard Perron seems to agree.
Untold House, Atari 2600, was the first survival horror because, you had to get to this dark house.
But regardless, Haunted House has got a majority of the elements coming together, even if it's, of course, as we've seen, not nearly the first to have a lion's share of them going on at once.
Everything old is new, right? That idea of the stalker in a game, that didn't just come from the games you play now, that came from games long ago. Certainly 3D Monster Maze has one of the all-time great stalkers in that dinosaur.
3D Monster Maze was developed for the ZX81 in 1982. The gameplay is somewhat similar to Hunt the Wumpus in that you're in a randomly generated maze with a monster roaming around. The difference this time is that it's a vicious T-Rex named, well, Rex, who looks like Barney if he didn't have his morning coffee, or maybe too much coffee because this dude is pissed. You have no way of fighting back, and you have to perfectly evade Rex and find the maze's exit to win. The only help that you get are warnings at the bottom of the screen to account for the lack of sound effects. These will tell you warnings like, Rex has seen you, or he's right behind you, run. Thankfully, you're faster than the T-Rex, or you really would be toast, but you can't make a wrong move or you'll get picked off pretty easily. And unlike Hunt the Wumpus, the action is relatively real time, so you can't just sit there and think about your next move. You've got to just keep moving and pay attention to the warnings and act accordingly. And quickly. Interestingly, Rex has a somewhat advanced AI structure, a bit like the opposite of the way the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation works. He'll stop pursuing you as doggedly if you get enough distance between you and him, but his pursuit will ramp up the closer that you get. He may wander the maze in an indirect pattern, but he'll shoot straight for the player if he gets his sights on you. It's honestly really tense stuff, but it's unlike anything that gaming had ever seen to this point, and is fondly remembered with many fan remakes. It's a wonder this game even exists, considering that its creator, Malcolm Evans, was an aerospace engineer that just made this game on a whim after getting the ZX81 computer as a birthday gift from his wife. He only even added the monster at J.K. Gray's own suggestion after they met in passing in a classical guitar club in Bristol. But I guess Malcolm wanted to give us a gift on his birthday because this thing informs so much of the tension and thrills of stalker horror that we see throughout so many games, including survival horror. Retro Gamer even claimed that
survival horror may have been a phrase first coined by Resident Evil, but it could have easily applied to Malcolm Evans's massive hit.
Edge magazine would corroborate this conclusion in their April 2006 issue, saying,
"Ask any player out there and they'll tell you what 3D Monster Maze was chiefly about. Fear, panic, terror, and facing an implacable, relentless foe who's absolutely going to get you in the end. At its heart, 3D Monster Maze is the original survival horror game. Perhaps the last thing anyone, even its author, expected to find when they first picked up that innocent-looking little plastic box."
Now, despite including it in this list for a reason, I hesitate a bit to call it survival horror in the strictest sense, as it's essentially a maze game with no puzzles, no item collection or resource management, no backtracking that has any purpose other than, evasion. But the claustrophobic first-person view and terrifying disempowerment of being unable to rebuff the beast and the frantic scramble to get out at least embodies the slasher movie experience to a T, and it's hard to overstate just how important it was to have a game that felt truly terrifying in the 80s. Sandy White would be the next frontiersman of a burgeoning genre with his 3D ant attack game in 1983 for the ZX Spectrum. Despite studying at the Edinburgh College of Art, Sandy's even bigger passion was electronics, and he rigged up remote-controlled sculptures to put on a one-man show. White wanted to make an inhabitable digital world even more than simply play-act his way with sculptures, so he promptly hacked up one of the most original games of its era. For one of, if not the first times, 3D Ant Attack let you choose between a boy and a girl character. Your character must traverse the world of Ant Escher in hopes of finding whichever character you didn't pick, and then escorting them back to the starting point, avoiding ants by walking up tall structures or directly engaging them as you go. But you've only got 20 grenades, 20 health, and a 1,000-second time limit to do that, so you gotta be careful. Each hit you take equates to 1 of your 20 life points, so you'd think that you can soak damage a bit and be fine, but the game gets pretty harrowing once the ants start to swarm you and easily overwhelm you. It's not the world's most enduringly pretty game, but it does have style, from its MC Escher-inspired environments, its vibrant sound effects, and its colorful UI and mission screens. Importantly, it's one of the first games to really put the pieces together. You've essentially got one big environmental puzzle to do. You can either try to evade enemies, or you can choose to use your limited ammo on them to give yourself some breathing room, and you got the pressures of a time limit and limited resources to pull off your goal.
Gameplay, someone kindly informed me today that it falls into the horror... Can't remember. It's got a genre, and I thought, yes, I wrote something that fits in a genre. It's a horror something, and there are a few other games around like it. But...
And while Sandy might not quite remember what genre he made a game for, everyone else certainly should. Forbidden Forest was designed by Paul Norman and published by Cosmi Corporation in 1983 for the Commodore 64 and Atari 8-bit computer line. In this game, you play as a Rambo-looking dude armed with not but a bow and arrow. Unfortunately, you've got a lot more than Wumpuses to hunt. Armed with 4 quivers of arrows per level, you've got to take out or avoid all comers, which can be anything from giant frogs to spiders or dragons or even a demogorgon. Paul Norman put on quite a clinic here, as this is one of the first games to have animated blood and have a day and night cycle, which adds a ton of ambiance. While Norman was more of a film guy who acknowledged the limits of making games too much like movies, he definitely brought a lot of cinematic flair to the proceedings with the driving, weird music and the breathless action. Okay, now I know just saying the word action without a huge disclaimer may have killed half of the survival horror purists watching right now, so let me try and bring you back to life, temporarily at least, by admitting this game didn't really seem like it fit into a survival horror video, even if guys like Bernard Perron seem to think it did. I mean, you are after all kind of just shooting arrows at endless hordes of monsters. But I had to admit, as YouTuber Cheeky Commodore Gamer said in his video, that you don't have to fight every monster that comes your way, you can just run away if they get too close. You don't want to risk dying or use too many arrows too quickly. So in the vein of ammo conservation and the option to run away being pretty important parts of survival horror optionality, and how various interviewers and YouTube commenters talk about how much this game scared the crap out of them as kids, I think we can at least give partial credit to it forming what the genre would become. But before we get to 1989, the real year of the first legit feeling survival horror games as we know them, let's take a brief detour into the land of the rising sun for 3 straight horror RPGs that are just RPG enough to not really be survival horror most of the time, but they do pull off some smart design that survival horror developers would later adopt and repurpose. The first is Laplace No Ma by Hummingbird Soft, which was released in Japan in 1987 for the NEC, PC 8801 and 9801, the Sharp XC8000. What are these names? The SNES, and the TurboGrafx CD. This is a turn-based JRPG of sorts set in a freaky mansion like Resident Evil and Sweet Home would be, but with quite a bit of Lovecraftian influence. You could choose from 4 classes in the dilettante, the detective, the scientist, the journalist, or the medium. I guess you know which one I'm picking, right? You can fight in classic JRPG style, but you can also choose to talk your way out of a fight if your charisma is high enough. If all else fails, you can run. There's a heavy emphasis on solving puzzles too, and a lot of backtracking that any Resident Evil fan will know as part of the whole experience. In short, this game has some sweet ideas that Sweet Home would later use that would in turn inspire Resident Evil, so I think Laplace No Ma deserves an honorable mention here. That same year, a very obscure and short-lived Japanese game studio called Fun Factory would put out their most well-known and probably most important game in Shiryou Sensen, War of the Dead, which had a sequel in 1988. Because these games never left Japan and have only been fan-translated, they've remained rather obscure. Kevin Gifford, a noted Japanese translator and games writer for publications like 1UP and GamePro, ran a now-defunct blog called Magweasel where he documented much of the series' backstory, including a 2008 GameSide interview with series designer Katsuya Iwamoto. Iwamoto was inspired to make a horror game in the vein of Dragon Quest, although he admits Stephen King's The Mist as well as John Carpenter's Escape from New York were inspirations. Not unlike the later STARS unit featured in Resident Evil, War of the Dead stars Leela, a member of SWAT or Supernatural and Special Weapon Attack Team. She reports to an area with all comms cut off, and soon the Marines there disappear mysteriously, and you've got to figure out why. Traipsing across a big post-apocalyptic landmass with tile-based movement, fighting off mutants and other baddies with your firearms, and side-scrolling real-time battles like Zelda 2. That all sounds a bit like Resident Evil's plotline. It's probably because Resident Evil was inspired by it. I can't prove it, but it's a solid hunch. As for gameplay, what's neat is that while a bit awkward and brutally hard sometimes, you can choose to shoot your way out, or use a knife, or even run away if you want, a dilemma that many survival horror games classically encourage. Because ammo is scarce, you'll be doing a lot less classic shooting than you would in an action game. As many battles, even against low-level enemies, will just eat right through your ammo. Your knife's more powerful, but that means you have to get close to enemies and risk taking a lot of damage. The game also doesn't really balance very well for whether you've got remotely enough stuff on you to take out the admittedly cool bosses, so you can get stuck more than once here and not know exactly how to progress, especially since some enemies take no damage from certain weapons, and escaping can just take longer than you've got health to spare. You've got the ability to use a psychic buff to make your weapon do more damage, but it'll run out of charge fast and you'll have to go sleep to recharge it. In addition to only being able to carry 14 items in your inventory, you can see how this was very possibly a point of inspiration for later survival horror designers, if not simply the first iteration of the burgeoning design philosophy that Fun Factor could lay some claim to. Kevin Gifford and also John Szczepaniak describe it as the first survival horror game, and while probably not remotely technically true, I get where they're coming from. And considering how the game revels in its difficulty, scarce resources, and small inventory size, and generally kind of freaky atmosphere, I'd say this is a notable forebear of Evil Residence's dark loneliness and quiet mounds. Its action-oriented sequel, War of the Dead Part 2 in 1988, was much less so survival horror, as it did the thing that every survival horror series does at one point, where it ramps up the action to the point where it becomes a fundamentally different experience. Leela can be a bit clunky here, but her guns now have unlimited ammo, and save points are much more generous. The tone is also a lot less horrifying to me as well. You know, there's just bright streets and you're wandering around them chilling out with some nice music. I will say the bosses are absolutely vile, and the amount of big mutated animals reminds me a lot of how Resident Evil would go for big spiders and snakes and all that stuff right off the bat. I also have to give these games credit for establishing the whole cataclysmic event that, ruins the countryside and overruns it with monsters type of thing, which is not dissimilar to how the Umbrella Corps ruined Raccoon City in RE 1 through 3. The game's focus on telling a better story and having more cool set pieces like boss fights have more context and weight to them, more cinematic pacing, also feels decidedly Resident Evil in a good way. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Shinji Mikami and friends took a lot of inspiration from these games. Speaking of Resident Evil, we couldn't go far into a history of survival horror video without mentioning the very game it was supposed to be a remake of, which is Capcom's Sweet Home in 1989 for the Famicom. Developed alongside the film that came out at the beginning of the year, Sweet Home is essentially a JRPG without a lot of the RPG fluff that most Dragon Quest type games had. Enemies weren't constantly dropping loot, and the experience point system was streamlined, with each battle won simply making your characters generically stronger in their stats. You had keylock designs with 5 unique characters who each came with their own unique item, like a lockpick, vacuum cleaner, or camera that could unlock or solve a specific problem like a Metroidvania. Like how the vacuum cleaner is needed to suck up all the glass strewn about in front of the first door that you need to get through. Items can be picked up and dropped, something that Alone in the Dark often gets credit for, but which definitely occurred here prior to that game. And because your characters stayed dead if they died, a game would also let you find and pick up the same item that they were carrying elsewhere in the manors to make sure you were able to progress and beat the game. Sweet Home also has 5 different endings that depend on how many characters remain alive after the last boss. party size is actually an indirect way of encouraging the resource management crunch that later survival horror would employ. Because you can only drag around a max of 3 of your 5 party members at a time, and you'll never quite know if dropping an item now might be the one that you needed to have just around the corner. The uncertain nature of what matters is a core component of survival horror. I'll interject it's also one of my least favorites, as backtracking for the sake of my pockets being too small is not an interesting ask to me, but I digress because many fans do like it and it's in full effect here. Kotaku's Peter Tirias described one such great moment of triage.
In the lakeside, there are a bunch of thorns that will damage you unless you have a pair of gloves, but you only get one, meaning you have to take a single party of 3 all the way through, which equals 6 total items minus the 1 for the glove. You need several wood logs to cross over little rivers, so do you drop the tonics, which cure you, or leave behind a rope that you might need shortly after? Considering that this area had the toughest enemies yet, the sense of peril was heightened.
Speaking of combat, it's turn-based first-person stuff like Laplace No Ma. A cool wrinkle though is that you can gang up on enemies by calling in your other party members to aid you, and that'll help you level them all up at the same time. I'd say this game is much more of a horror RPG than survival horror per se, but it still certainly does what it can to make the game less about stat crunching and loot, and more about immediate, tangible do-or-die scenarios. Destructoid's Alistair Penzoff spoke of how effective this tension was.
You'd think surviving off a limited amount of tonics would drive you mad, but the game is so well designed, you'll always find one when you're on the verge of dying. Like Half-Life and Dead Space, Sweet Home does such a great job of drawing out tension by providing health at just the right moment. I never ran into a problem, but I always felt like my situation was hopeless. The game gets easier by the end, but the bulk of it requires you to play smart and use tonics sparingly.
Importantly, Sweet Home reinforced the anxiety of item management and losing a party member to permadeath with an unsettling atmosphere created by creepy sound design and unnerving notes about the mansion's messed up backstory. These would be the perfect precedent for Resident Evil's classic notes like the famous itchy one. In a Game Informer article, Ben Reeves praised how director Tokuro Fujiwara sold the game's horror setting.
As players explored the mansion, furniture would suddenly move to attack them, ghosts could be seen fluttering down the hall out of the corner of the screen, and distorted animal sounds would be heard echoing through the mansion's blood-scrawled halls. Sweet Home's graphics seem crude by today's standards, but when players first got their hands on the game 2.5 decades ago, many of them were too scared to play in the dark. Fujiwara had accomplished his goal. No one had ever seen anything like Sweet Home before.
But they would soon see something very similar. Now, Resident Evil is of course indebted at its core to Sweet Home, being conceived as a remake of it, but the similarities run much deeper. The loading screens being door-opening animations is a classic reference, and the QTE-like button presses that you need to hit at just the right time to avoid dying in environmental hazards is kind of a foreshadowing of RE4 onward. We even saw this continued theme of the house having traps, like the House of Usher did, and Alone in the Dark would later have. I also think it's likely that the huge monster at the end of the Sweet Home movie may have influenced the scale and monstrosity of those T-virus injected monsters that would show up in later Resident Evils. Ben Reeves would sum up Sweet Home's influence quite well.
Many of Resident Evil's most iconic elements, including the mansion setting, multiple protagonists with specialized items, environmental puzzles, telling a story through scattered notes, item management with a limited inventory, and even the door loading screen, are all on display in Sweet Home. Resident Evil and the entire horror genre owe a blood debt to this long-forgotten 8-bit game that had no right to be as good as it was.
Even Shinji Mikami recently expressed his desire to remake Sweet Home. Considering how unique this game is and how out of sync it would be with modern Silent Hill or Resident Evil, I can only imagine how cool and different this could be. But while Sweet Home is absolutely one of the most important games in the evolution of what would become known as survival horror, it is only a shadow of things to come, and our next game is nearly the perfect embodiment of the genre as we've come to know it. I'm talking about the forgotten forefather of modern survival horror, Project Firestart. Project Firestart released the same year as Sweet Home in 1989, quite a year. It was designed primarily by Dynamics co-founders Jeff Tunnell and Damon Sly, and published by EA. No offense to previous games that we've spoken about, but this game has a special sort of originality and creative verve that sets this game apart from its predecessors. Jeff Tunnell recalls the advent of Project Firestart coming from what Trip Hawkins, the founder of his publisher EA, had once asked.
Can a computer make you cry?
Tunnell responded that,
We thought, well, that may be kind of hard, but maybe it could make you feel fear.
Tunnel started with an easy source of inspiration, the sci-fi horror of the Aliens franchise, a series often cited as the inspiration for games like Doom and even space freighter Nostromo that we already talked about. We play as John Hawking, who's sent to investigate the ship Prometheus, which has stopped responding to comms. You're instructed to retrieve all the data on board and then blow the thing sky high, because the research being done here is too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. Soon, Hawking finds out just how right they are. The ship's crew has nearly all been killed by horrifically mutated monsters. So you've got to get the data, blow the ship, and save any survivors while avoiding these monsters and making your escape. That may sound a bit generic, but how it plays out is brilliantly distinct and well paced. For one, Project Firestart is deeply cinematic for its time. Project Firestart is no stranger to framing the action in various different perspectives as you go into rooms, and it can even lapse into side-scrolling for areas where enemies appear to make it easier to see them and to feel like you're in a duel. There's a subtle 2.5D depth to the frame that makes traversing the environments feel more realistic and immersive, and it also makes the scene itself more interesting than if you were simply side-scrolling or even maybe following behind them in the modern over-the-shoulder camera view. The storytelling can also be essentially its own perspective switch too, as the game is not afraid to jump scare you with cutscenes. These remarkably well animated and rather gruesome scenes that trigger based on a location you crossed into, or if a certain amount of time has passed. Oh, there's a time limit too, as if there wasn't enough pressure to achieve your somewhat nebulous goals. This game's pretty complex for the year 1989. The ship is almost more confusing by its non-3D layout, as it's hard to map out mentally. There are also notes and logs and terminals that world build but also tip you off organically to how you can solve your goals on the ship, like what switching certain devices on and off will do to further your goals, or even give you insight into how to defeat monsters who have specific weaknesses. Despite the audio log still being a ways out in 1994 with System Shock, here we get a really good idea of how important and effective this type of backstory device can be. And when you're not reading, you'll often need to return to the med stations to get healed up, and you'll want to make sure to check all the dead bodies you can for items. Firestart also has inventory management concerns, like how if you want to pick up a laser, you can't if you already have 2 lasers and haven't depleted all the ammo in at least one of them. It's weird, but it's trying to put the screws to you in an interesting way. It's kind of like how you can't reload a magazine if you haven't used up all the bullets in it, that kind of balancing idea. There are some rough balancing ideas here though, which brings us to the combat. Lasers can only hit one target at a time, so if multiple enemies are attacking you, you'll likely not be able to kill them both before the one you're not shooting at will get you. You also can't move and fire at the same time. Like most survival horror games in the 90s and 2000s, use stop and pop. Enemies aren't fast, but they are scary, accompanied by swelling music and not slowing down as you tear into them. If enemies do get close, they automatically deal damage till you get far enough away again. You can run past them, but they'll damage you for at least 3 bars worth of health for doing so. So it's a bit adjacent to how survival horror often works today, where running away skillfully often lets you avoid damage or at least heavily mitigate it, in turn preserving the use of your offensive resources. Here, your health is essentially another resource to gamble by giving up life points now in hopes that the progress gained will be worth it more in the long term. You may be thinking, well, why don't you just run the opposite direction and avoid all the damage in the first place? Well, just know that the monsters can show up anywhere, and sometimes they'll show up on both sides of you. Or if you're in a corner at the end of a hallway and you come out of a door and they're coming from the only exit, you can just kind of be stuck here. There's a butt ton of save scumming that I had to do on the emulator I was playing, and honestly, if that hadn't been available to me, I'm not quite sure how I would have gotten through this at all. It's honestly amazing how creative and yet also kind of brutally difficult this game is. It's honestly a bit too much for how finicky the controls are, but it's theoretically fantastic, and I'm amazed at just how many staples of the genre were fully formed here, like the fight or flight considerations, respawning monsters that can pursue you through doors unless you lock them behind you, kind of like Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth. There are enemies that can only be damaged by specific parts of the ship and, kind of learning how they work. It's all really clever, kind of immersive sim-esque too. For instance, that mutant that the Prometheus scientist named Fred notes that he's died from -5 temperatures before, and a video log you pick up confirms this. Too much oxygen kills the other mutant Sid, and high radiation kills the mutant Marty. So in old school video game logic, you're going to have to kill these otherwise invincible monsters the same way yet again, now that they've come back to life. There are also multiple endings, like if you choose to save Mary, the last survivor on board who's in cryosleep, or if you've retrieved the science log. And that's just a couple of the factors you need to take into consideration when playing. So let's just go ahead and walk through the whole game really quickly to show you just how complex the game's design is. So when you realize that Mary is still alive via cutscene, you have a limited amount of time to go unlock her pod. Then you can get her into the waste disposal area to hide, but she can die if you take too long to retrieve her or if she gets touched by any mutants. This becomes an Ashley RE4 style escort mission. Then, 5 minutes later, a blackout will occur and you can return to the room where I played with the power on and off setting earlier. That is, if you can remember where it is. Good luck. It's not easy to map this game out in your head. Then, you have 25 minutes until the self-destruct happens. While there are green monsters all over, the white monster here is the souped-up version that you're going to want to kill, and there are tons of different ways to kill it. There are also permutations of the endings where not killing one character early on will result in them showing up a bit later. Sometimes failing an objective gets you chastised in a voice chat with your superior, or sometimes you can outright run into a game over if you don't dodge a bullet in a scripted sequence. Now I'll admit, I didn't particularly enjoy playing the game per se, as it's just way too vague and there are too many areas you get kind of unfairly boxed in and you have no way to get out. It's just so easy to die and get screwed, but conceptually, and trying to inhabit the mind of a player seeing this type of game for the first time, this game is one of the most underrated I think I've ever seen for its time. I just have to admire the craftsmanship and the genius of how tactile and interactive and interlocking the world feels, how tense and scary it could be, especially with way above average cutscenes for the time, and for the creativity and the emergent feeling of all of its different endings and ways to solve problems. Project Firestart may not have started the fire, perhaps it was always burning since the world started turning, but it sure kept it burning as a trailblazer. We can justifiably say that it set the stage for what survival horror would be. An isolated setting featuring a lone protagonist, fixed camera angles, the need to run past some enemies or at least the option to do so, the stop and pop shooting, the limited ammo supply and how you can only carry 2 weapons at once, and the multiple endings. It's quite unfortunate that despite the game's brilliance, Jeff Tunnell has more or less sworn off the game. It was a very long development cycle for the time at 2.5 years, and the Commodore 64 just wasn't up to the ambition of the title that they were making. European critics praised the game, but it got very little marketing and never sold very well. Tunnell nor his company ever made another game like it. Not even a horror game.
I don't even like horror. Honestly, this game was so hard that once we moved on and finished it, I hardly paid any attention to that genre afterwards.
So like many great artists, they don't always know just how valuable their work is to other people, especially not if they don't get any of that value sent back to them in terms of financial stability. But to make sure that we realize the value, let's do a quick recap of all the games that got us to this point and what this would mean for the future of games and the as yet unrealized classic survival horror template. Hunt the Wumpus would start the train in 1973 with its limited ammo, hide-and-seek gameplay, its stalker enemy, and hazards that could kill you in an instant. In 1980, we got the House of Usher, ushering in limited inventory and diminishing stats you needed to find items to replenish, as well as trying to avoid triggering those hazards. Combat requires you to line up shots, you get et. The game also kind of had multiple endings like a Silent Hill would, in that there were multiple victory conditions. This game to me is actually the most ahead of its time, because it has so many of the tropes that we wouldn't see fully realized until almost a decade later. Deathmaze 5000 gave us a creepy, isolated play space full of esoteric puzzles like you might solve in Alone in the Dark or Silent Hill, and it tested your resolve with the need to find food and torches or you'd die. Probably the least important game to our thesis that we're talking about in this video, but I think it's a nice microcosm of the features that would make up the games that further contextualize them in a horror setting later on. Space Freighter Nostromo in 1981 is often called one of the very first survival horror games because you have a stalker enemy that you can't fight back against, and you have to sneak around and not get got while retrieving items necessary to win the game. 1982 gave us 2 very formative survival horror adjacent experiences in 3D Monster Maze with its invincible stalker enemy Rex, and Haunted House had limited inventory space where you had to drop and pick up items a lot, as well as a creepy atmosphere filled with enemies that you needed to avoid or attack only if you had a special item, and a limit of 9 lives to win the game. A year later, 3D Ant Attack let us fight the terrifying swarms of ants either with limited grenades or with our wits, and our health pool was a resource that we could use to avoid or withstand damage as we retrieved our friend and escorted them out to win the game. Forbidden Forest that same year made us look like an action game, but its freaky music and weirdo atmosphere enhanced its fight-or-flight combat to where it didn't feel like a power fantasy at all. In 1987, Laplace No Ma took its place as one of the first horror RPGs that Sweet Home could possibly be seen as a descendant from. Again, combat had flexibility to it where you could fight if you wanted to, or you could conserve your resources and run away, so you could live on to solve some classic survival horror puzzles. That same year, Shiryou Sensen, War of the Dead, put you through long-winded exploration, intense combat where ammo was scarce, and you only had 14 inventory slots. Its 1998 sequel would seem to prototype a lot of the plot points like the disaster in Resident Evil, and the bosses being giant mutated animals. 1989 would be the year that survival horror really started to take recognizable shape, though. Sweet Home would be the inspiration for Resident Evil, from its door-opening animation, to picking up and leaving items around as needed, to solving environmental puzzles, and its scary mansion setting and horrific visuals. But Project Firestart jump-started the type of third-person fixed camera angle survival horror that Alone in the Dark would soon combine in a very similar package. Firestart had stop-and-pop shooting, enemies that you had to decide whether you wanted to run from or engage, depending on your loadout, and inventory concerns where you could only pick up so many weapons, and you had to hold on to low ammo guns until you depleted them, which was a source of tension in and of itself. And more so than any other game before it, the world was littered with organic world-building logs and notes that not only filled you in on the history of the place and made its horrors come to life, but it gave you subtle clues as to how to manipulate the world and win the game, achieving one of its many actually different endings, a feature that we wouldn't see for several years.
What are you talking about?
A feature that we wouldn't see for several years yet in the first Clock Tower, the first Resident Evil, or what would become a staple of Silent Hill games thereafter. Project Firestart is tense, rewards improvisation, and requires quick thinking, as well as being the game that established so many of the tropes into the lexicon of what survival horror would soon turn out to be. And that brings us to the close of our video today. The stage set, the most pure form of survival horror nearly upon us in Alone in the Dark and Clock Tower, and then the game that really set the genre on fire in Resident Evil. Now if this seems like a weird place to stop, then just know that I have covered the entire Alone in the Dark series in great detail. I'm very aware of how important it is, and I love talking about it. So I've got the link on screen that you can click on, and it'll be in the description too. It was my first ever hit on YouTube, so I've always been pretty proud of it and kind of connected to the series as a result, but I also had a really good time playing these games and talking about them and discovering this old, weird series. Now, if you're wondering why I cut out just before Dr. Hauser or Ecstatica, it was a little bit that the scope of the project was just sort of ballooning to the point where it's like, when do you stop? So I'll kind of take those games on a case-by-case basis, see if I have enough to say about them. They're also kind of famously hard to get running, especially Dr. Hauser, so we'll see if those ever come to be. But one thing I can assure you is that I'm going to be tackling Clock Tower as my Halloween video this year. Several of you over the years have requested this, so I think it's high time to satisfy your desires on that front. But anyway, just a taste of what's to come, and I hope you enjoy learning about all these old formative games as much as I enjoyed the process of learning about them. So if you're not good and ready to go play all these for yourself, I hope you've at least been able to appreciate how much their accomplishments contributed to even greater games that we enjoy that iterated on these concepts. And before we go, I must shout out all the awesome guest stars that we had in this video. They were awfully kind and gracious with their time, very professional, did a great job. So my hat's off to you all, and thank you so much for taking the time and making this video much better than it would have been otherwise. All right, everybody, till next we meet, stay safe, grab a light, don't go alone. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching. So, if you're enjoying the channel and really want to help it get to the next level, please consider becoming a patron or a channel member. By doing so, you'll be shouted out in the credits of every video, get early access to new videos, receive game keys as available, and even be able to vote on or contribute to upcoming projects. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, these people thought so, and I have to thank them for their generous support. Starting with Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Yak Show, Bibby F. and Bloxburg, Melancholy Geek, and Luke Dudney. Thanks for signing on. I really appreciate it. And an extra special shout out to James Wyatt and the Nth Review for contributing to my highest tiers. And if you're not tired of me by now, go ahead and check me out in the Quad Damage podcast, where I'm joined by Deadforge and Robert Yap as we talk first-person games with developers, gaming personalities, and content creators alike. God bless you, everyone, and I'll see you soon.